Hey shitters, I know I haven't updated this channel in a bit. I've been moving lately, so I haven't had time to make a lot of videos. Actually, my Grandpa, be careful with that. Oh, shit! Grandpa! GTO, Great Teacher Onizuka, is a 1999 anime adaptation of a manga by the same name, written by Toru Fujisawa. It follows Kichi Onizuka, a 22-year-old ex-biker gang leader. Despite the fact that he's just about the least scholarly person you can imagine, Onizuka has developed a passion for teaching, and episode 1 is his first outing as a student teacher. He's excited to start his job, fantasizing about all the great times he's going to have with his students, when boom. He finds that the first class he's assigned to is a trouble class full of gangbangers. These kids don't respect him, they spit in his face, and later they blackmail him when he's trying to help a student. What does Onizuka do? He doesn't quit or try to snake out of it or something, he faces the problem head on in his own way. Later, while the dickhead kids who blackmailed him are hanging out in a park, they suddenly find themselves surrounded by a gang of bikers who claim they're on their turf. Just when it seems like they're going to get the shit kicked out of them, Onizuka arrives and starts fighting back. The gangsters then realize who exactly Onizuka is. He's a legendary biker who apparently did a bunch of crazy cool shit in the past. The bikers worship the ground he walks on, and Onizuka takes the opportunity to beat the shit out of those kids.
So guys, how do you like midnight water? Had enough yet?
Please don't kill us, Mr. Onizuka!
Oh, don't worry, I'm having way too much fun torturing you.
Hey, teacher, you just can't go around torturing students, it's just not ethical.
Quit whining! You're pathetic! You call me teacher and become my students whenever it's convenient to you?
Don't underestimate me, you jerks! Teachers are human too. They have a time for getting mad and a time for blowing it. Besides, I'm not a teacher yet officially.
Onizuka later realizes he's probably screwed. I mean, he literally assaulted children, right? But when he arrives at school the next day, he finds his delinquent class cleaning up the school without his asking. Something about his lesson tamed them or spoke to them on some level. Not in the sense that they've been intimidated into submission, but rather that the lesson humbled them in some way. When Onizuka's tenure as a student teacher ends, his students actually start crying at the thought of him leaving because they've supposedly come to respect him so much in that time. Other members of the teaching community take notice of Onizuka's gift for discipline, and eventually he finds full-time employment at Holy Forest Academy, which is where the series really starts. Onizuka is assigned to be the homeroom teacher for class 3-4, which is also full of delinquent kids, but these ones are different. They're in a league of their own. They don't just heckle their teachers, they concoct elaborate and ruthless schemes to get under their skin. The last few people who tried to teach them were apparently driven over the edge with mental abuse, one of whom was hospitalized from their trauma. It's Onizuka's job to discipline each and every one of these kids, which is most of what he does over the course of the show's 43-episode run. The series is one long collection of self-contained episodes, where in each a new troublemaking student emerges, and Onizuka sets out to turn them over from the dark side to the light. I suppose it's like a Monster of the Week format, but the monsters are children with behavioral issues. He doesn't beat these kids up like he does with those earlier ones, but he does meet them on their level and teaches them figuratively in a language they can understand. While the show takes place in a modern-day Tokyo and can technically be considered a work of realistic fiction, it goes so far with some of its wacky moments that it really straddles the line of reality. Like, I'd say the plots of like 90% of the episodes require heavy suspension of disbelief, because I don't think any of this shit would ever fly in real life. Basically half the shit Onizuka does is stuff you can never get away with, especially as an employed teacher. He crosses a lot of lines, both in terms of social norms and boundaries, as well as what's possible in the realm of actual physics. For instance, there's an episode where Onizuka takes an exam after getting shot in the stomach 3 times. Don't worry though, he's up and about again by the end of the episode. So things get real crazy, but it never gets quite to the point where it's just a straight up broad comedy on the level of something like Monty Python, Airplane, or fucking SpongeBob, you know? Like Onizuka isn't necessarily pulling anvils out of his back pocket and crushing people, although he does dabble in magically summoning fun costumes, so we're kinda on the borderline. The show still retains some level of reality, striking a nice balance between being a realistic drama and off-the-walls cartoon. I'd compare it tonally to something like those Yakuza games, or maybe a sitcom like It's Always Sunny. It definitely doesn't happen in real life, but maybe it could happen in real life. The fact that GTO is grounded in this level of reality means that when it does cross those boundaries, it really means something. It makes you cringe or tense up when Onizuka does something risky because you feel like there could be actual repercussions for what's happening. Like, I don't watch a lot of Family Guy, but I know if Peter Griffin commits a sex crime or murders somebody, that it doesn't really matter and won't change anything, because that's just the show's style. But if Onizuka does something a little risque, and I'll talk about this later, I genuinely do grit my teeth a little. Like, obviously Onizuka will make it out okay, the show's about him, but I still get a little tense. While the show is more comedy than drama, it does attempt to bring some genuine moments of emotional vulnerability. After all, the premise is that we're helping troubled kids deal with ongoing traumas in their lives, so these moments are inevitable, and the show is usually tasteful enough not to trample them with comedy or irony. That being said, the melodrama never cuts too deep. Like, you're probably not going to cry over GTO. It's less Eternal Sunshine and more The Holiday, you feel me? It's more about tugging on your heartstrings than it is about making you take a 90-minute shower later. Comedy is the name of the game, and GTO wins my heart as the funniest anime I've ever watched. Usually anime comedy is either straight up unfunny, or it just fails to translate its humor into English. So props to the original mangaka and the show's writers for coming up with some funny stuff, and to the localization team for keeping the comedy intact. So yeah, that's kind of the general premise and style of Great Teacher Onizuka. I'll go a bit more in depth about its dub, characters, and plots later in the video. For now, let's talk about visuals. Talking first about animation, GTO's is rather adept, but also very limited. There weren't any moments that blew my cock off, but there's still a lot to like. There's a lot of cartoony, bombastic humor, so naturally a lot of time went into realizing that stuff at the expense of slower moments. Characters might be a bit statuesque at these parts, but even still, they're generally posed and framed in a compelling enough way that it doesn't get boring to look at. The animators might not always have had the most frames, but they did the most they could with each one. In fact, the show's scope seems just about perfect for its apparent budget. To make an unfair comparison, it's not like that old Berserk anime, which I always thought bit off more than it could chew with its big battle scenes and how to realize them with low-budget 2D cell animation. Like, I enjoy that adaptation and respect the way it employs its limited animation, but the limitations are much more noticeable there since there's clearly a greater sense of scale that isn't fully realized. GTO has much more tempered ambitions. There are rarely more than a couple active characters on screen at any given time, so you don't get the sense that it's having to skimp on background animation. If you ask me, the show's biggest achievement visually is how well it does faces. If you're at least tangentially interested in anime, there's a decent chance you've seen some of these faces around. They're damn entertaining and iconic as shit. I think half the reason why I even like this show so much is because of these funny little drawings. In terms of character design, Onizuka is definitely the most inspired of anyone. I love his sense of fashion, and it's really cool how he wears a different outfit in pretty much every episode. The other characters usually don't look so eye-catching. In fact, I thought the designs were pretty restrained for an anime of this sort. Usually this is the type of show where I'd expect there to be a bunch of characters with big watery eyes and wild-ass Yu-Gi-Oh air, but not so. You can tell them apart really easily, but none are as fleshed out as Onizuka, even in terms of how they emote. Like Onizuka, on top of his personality and character design, assumes a lot of really interesting and unconventional poses which communicate a fuck ton about his character. For example, here's a scene where Onizuka goes deep into thought. He has a big conundrum to face, and being who he is, he knows he can't just take a straightforward approach to fixing the problem. They could have just drawn him scratching his chin or something equally cliche, but instead they have him do this. I love this pose because it shows how unconventional and outside the box Onizuka's thinking is. I'll talk a lot more about this later, but Onizuka isn't the type of guy who will take the easiest or most obvious option when it comes to fixing something, and him crossing his arms and doing a bridge pose, no hands, neck in serious jeopardy, is a great way of visually communicating that. I find myself looking for poses and body language and stuff like this in all sorts of stories. Maybe not stuff that's exaggerated as this pose, but just that level of detail where the characters can express themselves in unique visual ways. It just makes characters and scenes look way more visually rich, even if said visuals are fairly static, as is the case here. Not a whole lot of movement, but what's there has depth to it, again with the show's resourceful animation. So yeah, GTO doesn't have crazy visuals or anything, it's not Gainax, it's not Studio Ghibli, but I do find it quite appealing. Sound time! Full disclosure, I'm watching the English dub of this because Amazon Prime, which is what I'm watching it on, doesn't have the sub, and I can't be fucked to track it down. I'm so fucking tired. This dub is kind of funny. It's adeptly made most of the time, but it's still flawed on just a technical level. Here's some weird moments I found.
And you call yourself a teacher, shame on you.
And hey, what's the matter? Didn't I wipe? What is it, Teach? Want him to come back and finish you off or what?
You gonna punch somebody?
Also, something else I noticed is that this kid, Murai, has his voice completely changed partway through the show for some reason.
Plan C seems to have worked out well. This could be the quickest win we've ever had.
You idiots! Have you forgotten all the things that asshole's done to my friends? Onizuka's the enemy. That means anyone who laughs at his jokes or treats him like a friend is in for a world of hurt, understand?
If I had to describe the style of voice acting in this dub, I'd say it's like a hybrid between every other stupid anime dub you've seen with like The Simpsons.
Take a hike, Wahara. I'm bored with your games and your little schemes. They're a waste of time. You'll have to find someone else to do your dirty work. I've got better things to do.
Mr. Simpson will now be autographing 8x10 glossies of Poochie. 1 per customer.
One of my favorites is the voice of Principal Sakurai, who's supposed to be like this wise Dumbledore type character, but they made her sound more like the type of elderly woman who thinks she can summon an incubus to murder Bush.
The money that was lost here belonged to the students. Whatever is to be done about Mr. Onizuka and the lost money will not be decided in this room. The final decision for these problems should be made by the students themselves.
Onizuka himself is voiced by Steve Bloom of Cowboy Bebop fame.
You don't really need to know my name, dirtbag. Just think of me as your basic wanderer with a guitar.
I think this is an excellent performance, one of the best things about the show. He has this rich voice which suits Onizuka's handsome, stylish, tough guy side.
You're a fine one to talk, you Weasley bastard. You inflict verbal abuse that's twice as damaging as anything they could dish out. How do you do that and still call yourself a teacher? It's because of teachers like you that those kids are systematically squeezed out of any safe haven that they might have ever known. If this is what you call education, I don't want to be a teacher.
But he can do this high-pitched voice and goofy laugh that satisfies his little freak side as well.
This bed even smells like her. I can't believe I'm in a woman's room. It's like winning the love lottery. Tonight, a man and a woman will lay side by side together under this very roof and have incredible study sessions every night for a week.
I'm sure the Japanese voice is really good too, and if you heard that first, you might feel weird hearing Bloom's voice coming out of the character. But Bloom is amazing, and I personally can't imagine Onizuka sounding any other way. Just a really solid performance and fantastic delivery on the humor in spite of some of the dub's weirdness. The show wouldn't be nearly as good to an English language viewer like me without it. I don't really have anything to say about the show's general music or sound design, except that they didn't particularly stand out to me. Not bad, just fairly stock. I'm sure there's plenty to like, but it just didn't impact me in any way. You know, I did have observations about. I hope you all get by now that I like this series. When I first started watching it, I thought I'd just make a short little video where I'd dump out some thoughts and call it a month, but I ended up having a lot to say about it. I'm not going to pretend like it's the greatest show or even the greatest anime I've ever seen, but I do find it very entertaining and I think there's a lot of substance beneath its comedic exterior. I just want to explore some of the interesting themes I eked out of it. Ready? Okay. At the heart of this series and its appeal is Mr. Ikichi Onizuka himself, who's such a colorful and compelling character that he pretty much carries the entire show on his back. While the other recurring characters usually provide us with some interesting stories and moments, none come remotely close to the raw power of our great teacher. Let's break him down. First observation is that he's a cool guy, but he's not too cool. Like, he's not going to distance himself from people because he thinks they'd cramp his style or whatever. He's open to hanging out with any sort of person. One of the first students he builds rapport with is this kid, Yoshikawa, who's so uncool that he owns a shirt that literally says loser on it, which is so unnecessarily demeaning to me that it's hilarious. The type of person who really wants people to see them as cool would avoid associating with this kid at all costs, out of fear that they'd be considered uncool by association, but Onizuka has no such insecurities. The outside world rarely acknowledges him as being cool anyways. In fact, most characters seem to have a pretty low opinion of him, but he doesn't really care. He himself kind of embodies a two-pronged ideal of coolness. To make up a term, because I don't know if anyone's ever given a name to this type of character, I'm gonna call him a handsome loser. He's a legendary biker gang leader, he's proficient in martial arts, he's in very good shape, he dresses really fashionably, he's passionate about his job, and he isn't afraid to question authority and go against the social grain. I'd fuck him. But he's also kind of a man-child. He doesn't wash his underwear, his room's a mess, he plays too many video games, he picks his nose, he's a porn addict, he bathes in the sink, and he never has any money. I'd still fuck him, but now I feel much more ambivalent about doing so. The unique chemistry of Onizuka's character traits are what makes him such a qualified character to deliver what I think is kind of the main theme of GTO, if there is one. See, within the realm of the teaching career field, Onizuka stands out as a free spirit in a sea of lost souls. Pretty much every other colleague of his puts things like social status and reputation over the actual art of teaching. You notice they value things like cars and awards, and neglect their students' well-being or even neglect their families if they have them. I think this represents a bit of broader social commentary which extends well beyond the borders of Japan. People have a tendency to project a vain ideal of themselves to the world, propagated by their awards and wealth for the sake of social validation. Everyone likes feeling validated, but there are much healthier ways of improving your self-image than relying on other people to give it to you. Acceptance from the people around you can feel good, but it can also be taken away if you don't conform to society's ideals. Most people probably fall outside of these acceptable guidelines, and some end up feeling the need to compensate for their quote-unquote imperfections by flaunting their achievements, wealth, or beauty. This is outer direction, the tendency to be directed in life by outside social pressure. Now look at Onizuka, who's just about as invalidated as someone can be. Society looks down on him for being a low-life thug, and it's also repeatedly driven home that he's a virgin in his 20s who's never had a girlfriend, which for a lot of young men can be a huge source of insecurity, since virginity can be seen as such a masculine mark of shame in current times. Despite that, the man's confidence knows no bounds. He gets a little blue about being a virgin sometimes, but it's usually more because he's thirsty for some action than it is because of self-hatred or shame. He doesn't base his behavior or perception of himself on what people around him think, and he's all the more content for it. This is inner direction. I think Onizuka's personal mission as a teacher is to pass this level of self-confidence down to his students. I'm going to be arguing this for the next few minutes, but before I do that, I want to establish that I have pretty much zero academic basis for a lot of the stuff I'm about to talk about. I'm just a normal guy who likes talking about TV shows, and these are all theories that arise from my own rinky-dink understanding of things like psychology and pedagogy. I strongly encourage viewers of this video to think critically about my perspective, especially if you're actually a professional on some of this shit and have a deeper understanding of it than I do. Feel free to challenge my opinions in the comment section if you so desire. Okay, let's go. See, if the people tasked with teaching the upcoming generations are the type who only believe in social validation, then those upcoming generations will become the same way. School systems generally have a bad tendency of instilling these beliefs in kids, what with their grading skills and honor rolls and what have you. In most schools, you have to do everything right and impress people with your achievements, otherwise you're a failure and or a pariah. This mentality is how you create people who lack integrity, the type who will bend to the will of authority and never question it. These people base their self-worth on the expectations of society and have fragile egos. They are therefore afraid of things like rejection and punishment, and will do anything to avoid them, even if that's lying or kissing ass. I think most people have at least some outer-directed qualities to them, myself included, but it's best not to let them rule your judgment and hopefully work through them so you can become a more confident person. Those who submit to this mentality are unlikely to meaningfully face social problems or improve society, and even worse, are destined for unhappiness. Onizuka rebels against this outer-directed system. Most of the time, he simply doesn't behave the way teachers are expected to. He's always breaking rules and social taboos. As a result, mostly everyone in his faculty hates him because he's this unpredictable anomaly that nobody can understand, yet his confidence is unfazed and he remains employed as a teacher. Unlike them, Onizuka has a strong sense of self-esteem and isn't ashamed of his ways of life, no matter how socially unaccepted they are. I called Onizuka a man-child earlier, but I'll be nicer now and say he's actually more like a man who accepts his inner child and lives unashamed of it. His colleagues have tendencies that are just as childish or weird, or sometimes even more so, only they put in much more effort to suppress those tendencies and keep up appearances. They're all children too, just in nicer suits. Naturally, Onizuka is much more popular with his students than his peers are. That's because he doesn't have that same wall of pretentiousness. He's actually able to relate with and impact his students because both parties can see themselves in one another. He also really cares about them. Like I mentioned earlier, most of the show's antagonists are troubled students, and Onizuka's goal in the show is just to mold them all into better people. He goes to great lengths to help these kids, often risking his career or even his own physical health to do so. As an actual classroom teacher though, Onizuka is pretty useless. It's mentioned that he himself was a bad student who cheated his way through school, so he'd much rather goof off with his students to build bottle rockets than read Play-Doh or some shit. He's not very bright at first glance, but beneath his exterior there's a sort of unconventional wisdom to him that very few in his world can appreciate. What Onizuka excels at is giving his students life lessons that usually take place outside of the classroom and make a much more profound impact on them. This unique approach is what's so revolutionary about Onizuka's teaching methods, specifically when it comes to discipline. See, there are two ways you can go about disciplining someone: the result-oriented approach and the process-oriented approach. Let me make a little diagram. Here's your issue. A group of students are bullying this other student, and your end goal is to stop that. A result-oriented teacher is going to look for the most direct solution possible to achieve said result. The result is all I care about. Maybe they'll do something like punish the bullies with detention or have one of those passive-aggressive group seminars about why you shouldn't bully people. Don't bully people, it's wrong. Let me explain why both of these result-oriented solutions can eat shit. Punishment communicates to the children that their wrongdoing has been noticed and will have consequences, but doesn't correct the inner evil that motivates that wrongdoing. Chances are these kids will continue being shitty and just be more cognizant about whether or not they can get away with it. Or hey, even if the punishment works and they never bully someone again, the change is still external because it only occurs out of fear for future punishment and not because they've actually reevaluated their morals. Again, outer direction. The assemblies are a better solution since they at least tend to try and educate students on the effects that bullying can have on victims and try to hit upon the kids' inner senses of empathy, but these assemblies are incredibly broad and impersonal. They're meant to reach as many students in as little time as possible. They're not taking the time to engage each kid individually and ensure they're all getting the message. They're just telling the collective to stop being bad. It'd be nice if things were so easy, but they're not. Onizuka doesn't believe in straightforward punishment, and he doesn't lecture his kids on how they should live their lives. He's process-oriented, meaning he focuses more on teaching the kids new ways of thinking that'll hopefully guide them towards the desired result, rather than just commanding them to change their behavior. The series is him taking the time to go through every one of his snot-nosed brats and steering them all down the path of goodness. The solutions he finds are tailored to each particular kid. To give an example, let's see how he disciplines this one kid, Kikuchi. Kikuchi is established to be very good with computers. He uses these abilities to fabricate unsavory photos of Onizuka, photoshopping him into various pictures that implicate him as a sexual deviant and posting them in public places where everyone can see. Not only is Onizuka embarrassed by these photos, but they actually cause him to doubt his sanity because the photos look so convincing that he'd sooner accept that he actually did these things in a fugue state than assume they were fakes. Eventually, Onizuka grows wise to it and confronts Kikuchi. He doesn't punish him or threaten him really. In fact, he does the opposite. He hires Kikuchi to make more doctored photos, asking him to composite body parts from several different porn star photos to make the ultimate fantasy woman for him. He even offers to pay him for the service. This impacts Kikuchi in a few ways. Firstly, it proves to him in a good way that Onizuka is just as low in the gutter as everyone else and isn't trying to mop up his reputation by forcing Kikuchi into submission through punishment like most other adults would in his place. This earns Onizuka his respect. It also demonstrates to Kikuchi that he has genuine value and could be using his abilities in more productive ways, which flips his motivations for the better. He's not going to harass Onizuka anymore because he no longer sees it as being worth his while. Now, I'm not saying real-life teachers should be asking students to make porn for them, just so they can learn something from how Onizuka manages to take delinquent kids and nurture them into functioning adults without shaming or punishing them. Here's another example, this time of a much more extreme subject. This kid, Arumi Kanzaki, is an evil bitch. She manipulates people into doing what she wants. She physically assaults Onizuka by having a snake by his penis. She sets multiple teachers on fire, and she bombs a school. She's fucking crazy. Maybe Arumi has a spot waiting for her in Gitmo, but Onizuka doesn't bother trying to punish her. Both because it wouldn't work, and because she's actually considered to be above punishment since she's a high-scoring student with a genius IQ, which earns her favoritism from Vice Principal Uchiyamada. Onizuka instead investigates Arumi's motivations. To summarize, he learns that she comes from an emotionally unavailable family and grew up as something of an outcast since all of her classmates othered her for her unusual intelligence. She found companionship in a young teacher named Miss Fujimori, who tutored her and became something of a parent figure to her, until Arumi's knowledge surpassed what Miss Fujimori was mentally able to teach, which wounded her ego. She was a professional who was being outsmarted by a child, so Miss Fujimori cruelly cut Arumi out of her life. Due to this lingering trauma, Arumi has decided that nothing in life matters and that she doesn't care what happens to her or anyone else, so it's okay for her to hurt people like this as long as she gets a kick out of it. So, in the end, Onizuka kidnaps her, straps her to his bike, and drives off a bridge. Arumi is scared shitless, and as her life flashes before her eyes, all she thinks about is her time with Miss Fujimori, and she calls out to her, yearning to see her again. Despite what she's been telling herself, Miss Fujimori absolutely matters to Arumi. A safety net catches them, they survive, and Arumi resumes her life as a better person with a genuine reason to live. She sees no reason to use her genius in the awful way she has been, and that chaos within her is now gone. Onizuka didn't take away her ability to do bad things, he instead transformed her desire to do bad things. The change is internal. Even if we hypothetically put this new Arumi in a situation where evil behavior is encouraged and with no punishments, like the purge or some shit, we can be sure that she'll actually resist that incentive because her morality isn't guided by laws or social pressure anymore. Again, I'm not saying we should be driving children off of bridges. I don't think we should be taking Onizuka's lessons very literally. But I hope I've made clear the value in Onizuka engaging with these children individually and teaching them about their own potential to be better people rather than threatening them into it. People who are disciplined in this way are more likely to become upstanding citizens, the type who aren't afraid to question authority. They aren't ashamed of who they are, and they accept their inner child. They have genuine self-esteem, and when they do something wrong, they don't punish themselves for it, they opt for self-evaluation and change. Process orientation, inner direction, self-esteem. Booyah! All this being said, I do want to criticize the show on some of the things I think it does kind of sloppily. First thing is that it deals with a lot of child psychology, but doesn't always give that topic the nuance it deserves. For example, the thing with Arumi is nice and all, but it's a crazy oversimplification of the plight of someone with a behavioral or mental disorder. This is a girl who lights people on fire and at some points threatens people with suicide, so it's a bit rich to suggest that she's all better after one enlightening moment. It's a good first step, but realistically, someone as troubled as her would have a much longer road towards recovery, and would have a much more complex web of deep-seated issues to untangle, which couldn't be undone so easily. In fairness, there are parts later where Arumi uses her evil bitch powers again, which suggests that she has room to grow, except one is out of a sense of righteousness, and the other is just for a gag. She isn't expected to undergo change for either. It might have been better if Arumi was treated more as a continuously developing character who improves herself over the course of the show, but she only ever gets that one major turning point. Again, I know GTO isn't supposed to be the most realistic thing ever, but it's weird that this girl goes from a psychopathic arsonist to a well-behaved student in the space of only a few minutes. Another thing on the subject of mental health is that there are a lot of moments where a kid attempts suicide in this show. It's a really weird motif that's thrown around lightly as a device to shock you. It's never meant to be comedic or anything as far as I remember, but it's also never given any sense of weight. It just kinda happens for the plot's sake. This is where the show's identity as a comedy conflicts with its identity as a drama. It has some dark subject matter, but can't fully embrace or explore it because it doesn't want to lose its ability to make you laugh. I'm not saying serious dramas can't also be funny, but it'd be pretty hard to accept some of the wacky shit that happens in the show after being asked to think seriously about suicide. Think about when Onizuka hires Kikuchi to make porn for him. I know in real life this action would be pretty heinous, a teacher asking a student to do something like this. But since we're in anime comedy land, my sense of disbelief is suspended, and I know that no harm is really being done here. Kikuchi isn't going to be emotionally scarred from this or anything like that, it's all in good fun. When you introduce suicide into the story though, it's pretty hard to tackle it in a serious way without also taking the audience out of that anime comedy land headspace. If we as the audience started to really empathize with these suicidal characters and let the emotions become real, we start questioning things. Like, how could driving off a bridge benefit Arumi in any way? If anything, she'd be more traumatized and mentally unstable, and Onizuka would be in jail. The show relies on its ability to depict implausible situations, so it can't risk things getting too real. Therefore, the suicide stuff is kept pretty superficial. We're meant to feel bad for survivors and victims, but not really asked to think too hard about anything. It just happens, and then it's done. I think the show would have been better off staying away from this topic because it comes off as very vain in how it depicts it. It's probably one of the worst parts about the show, if you ask me. After, of course, the worst part about it, which is the fact that Onizuka lusts after underage girls. It's a recurring plot element. Here are a bunch of clips where he creeps on or puts his hands on a young girl, and this isn't even most of them. He doesn't seek out sexual relations with these girls. His creeping is done at a distance, and whatever physical transactions he has are either unintentional, initiated by the other party, or aren't done for sexual reasons. But the fact that they even happen, or the fact that he has eyes for girls this age in the first place, are problems in themselves. Now, I'm guessing the grand majority of viewers agree with me that this is gross. It's not exactly a controversial opinion, so I'm not even going to bother arguing about it. I'm just pointing out that it's there. There's something I do want to talk about that's a bit more debatable. Some of the more keen viewers might have just had a That's So Raven flashback to earlier on in the video when I spoke much more lightheartedly about Onizuka beating up and torturing a few of his students as a way of getting through to them. And now you're asking, how can you excuse that while condemning this? Both are forms of child abuse and neither are okay to do in real life, but there are big differences in how the two things are depicted, and that's through devices like irony and tone. The comedy of this bit isn't that it's funny to see children get tortured, it's the fact that this is even being depicted in the first place, and it's seeing how far Onizuka can and will cross the line when he comes to it. It's so unexpected that you can't help but laugh, or at least have some kind of reaction to it. You might not have liked the depiction of child abuse or thought it was funny, but I doubt your takeaway was fuck this show, it's teaching people that beating kids is cool. The action is pretty obviously ironic and just meant for shocks. It's Onizuka's way of symbolically speaking to these wannabe tough guy gangster kids in particular, which is why they cry when he leaves. He's showed them that he's just as much of a brutal punk kid as them, and they start to see him as something of an idol since he's everything they've ever wanted to be. Violence is just their language. After seeing this bit, I personally don't get the impression that the show's creators condone child abuse, but I could be wrong. Now, I will admit that there is some irony to the way Onizuka lusts after underage girls. It's definitely seen as taboo or wrong, The show seems to suggest that he's pathetic for doing it, and Onizuka himself even says in the first episode,
Oh, what are you doing, Onizuka? You're getting too old for this stuff.
but he keeps doing shit like this over the course of the whole show. And hey, you know what? You can have a main character who does devious shit like this, as long as your tone indicates in some form that you're critical of the behavior. It might seem like the show has a low opinion of Onizuka's behavior, until it dives off the deep end and shows a cleavage shot. A lot of cleavage shots, and butt shots too. Basically any kind of fan service you'd expect from an older anime show like this. It's one thing to imply how much of a creep this guy is for creeping on girls, and it's something else entirely to say that and then proceed to let the audience creep on the girls as well. You can have a character do something risque without showing anything explicit if your story really needs that element to it, but letting the audience in on that quote-unquote fun, more often than not, sends the message that indulging this behavior is acceptable on some level. In general, I think this show puts forward a pretty unhealthy view towards young women, which I hate to say. It has redeeming qualities, but I can see why someone would be turned off from it for these reasons. Or I don't know, maybe you snowflake cuckboys can yuck it up and pick up a goddamn shovel. The last thing I'll say about this weird teenager shit is that it isn't even consistent with the stuff I've been saying about Onizuka being an interdirected person. It's something that he is actually ashamed of, as well as something that's actually validated by his society's laws at the time. If you didn't know, the legal age of consent in Japan at the time of the show's production was 13, which is crazy. And it didn't even change until the current year, 2023, which is crazier. Meaning it would have actually been in Onizuka's legal right to get with these girls, although fortunately, he never does go all the way. If he really is interdirected like I've been saying, and stands out as a teacher who actually does think of the children, then he wouldn't indulge in this behavior just because his society's rules allow it. This should be something he's actively rebelling against, not something he's complicit in. It's just so paradoxical for this particular character to behave this way in the first place. And before people shit on Japanese culture for all this, it's not just a Japan thing. There are plenty of movies from America and beyond that sexualize teenagers as well. It's grody no matter where you do it, and thankfully a lot of our cultures seem to be moving away from it right now. So yeah, if there's anything you should take away from the show, it's Onizuka's philosophy as an individualistic, self-motivated, self-confident person, and as a teacher who believes in process-oriented discipline. He might not fully practice what he preaches, but I think we can still learn a lot from him given we're cognizant of his faults. Final word, please don't be a sex pest. And only beat up children if it's really funny. I was rewatching some clips of the show on YouTube, and I saw some commenters calling the show rushed in comparison to the manga. I haven't read the manga, but based on what I've read about it, it's a bit different and a lot longer than the show. It actually ran for years after the anime's airing concluded. This explains why there were a bunch of narrative loose ends that unfortunately didn't go anywhere. Despite that, I think this show is cool, and I feel satisfied after having watched it, but it seems like it's meant to be more of an introduction to a larger body of work in the form of its manga. While the manga for GTO has officially ended as of 2002, there's currently a sequel series running called GTO Paradise Lost that's been going since 2014. Actually, fun fact, Great Teacher Onizuka happens to be the third entry in a whole franchise of manga series taking place in the same world, all in some way following Onizuka and or his friend Ryuji, both before and after the events of GTO. While I'm sure it makes for good reading, I think I'm ready to move on from the universe of Onizuka, at least for now. That's the end of the script. Folks, it's time to give an update on whatever the fuck happened in the intro. Over the course of the past 3 days I've spent recording this, my grandpa's condition has declined significantly. For full context, he was carrying a dresser that was full of my Genshin figurines. I'd estimate the total weight he was lifting was around 50 to 75 pounds, which is a lot for a man of his age. Somehow the head popped off one of my Charlotte figures as he was bringing the dresser down the stairs and, well, I think you heard what happened. He herniated a disc in his back, he shattered his hip, and the dresser smacked his head on its way down, which concussed him. It's probably the worst thing that could have happened to him, and I'm honestly a bit disappointed that he handled the dresser so irresponsibly. He's still hanging on right now, but nobody in her family really has any hope for his survival. I talked to his wife, and she said she plans to bury his ashes in Manila, where they hope to move one day. In his will, it's written that I'm the one to inherit his business, so I guess I'll be selling bone density scanners from now on. I don't think I have time for YouTube anymore, so I guess it's goodbye, Crank Squad Nation.
Goofball City, bitch.